Welcome back to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks, and we've been dealing for the last couple of presentations with fascism, that particular kind of ideology that reflects a variety of very intense ideological commitments to hyper-nationalism. Oftentimes there's a racial component to it. There is oftentimes an element of authoritarianism to it, the idea of a leader that is wrapped up in a cult of personality. It's something actually that fascism has in common with certain authoritarian or totalitarian variants of communism. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Nazism in Germany. We're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to continue or complete our presentation on Hitler, the excerpt from Mein Kampf, mainly kind of the anti-Semitic parts. Then we're going to talk about Nazism in theory and practice. And then we're going to conclude by discussing how Nazis perceive human nature and the idea of freedom. So Mein Kampf is written in the 9 months while Adolf Hitler has been in prison in 1923, 1920 into 1924, I think. He gets out, fairly quickly, despite having been convicted for what was effectively treason. Nevertheless, he's out and he's got a book to sell. And as I noted, Mein Kampf has really got a lot of, it really lays out what Hitler thinks about the world and what Hitler thinks about race. And a great deal of it is in kind of nauseous detail explaining why he hates Jewish people. And so with Hitler, so it is with Jews. There's several quotes on this particular slide. If by chance world Jewry were the only race on the planet, it would suffocate in dirt and feces. Mankind progresses despite, not because of, the Jews. Hitler and Nazis generally, they used a lot of propaganda to conjure images of Jews as parasites, as bloodsuckers, living, again, parasitically off nations. The argument was that Jewish people were often carriers of lice, which again was reflected in a lot of the posters and artwork of that period. Hitler would write, "The smarter the individual Jew, the greater his success in deceiving others." Hitler, again, in 1925, when Mein Kampf is published, he invokes the protocols of the elders, of the learned elders of Zion, as evidence that Jewish truth-telling is exposed for the lie that it is. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was first published in 1903 and purported to be a document revealing Jewish plans for world domination. The publisher deliberately obscured the text's provenance. The Protocols was first published in Russia, and it is probably one of the most influential pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda ever published. Hitler almost certainly was aware of the fraudulent nature of the work. The first publication to claim that the protocols were frauds was the British newspaper, The Times, in 1921. Historians widely believe that Okhrana, which was the Tsarist secret police, was responsible for the production of the publication, and much of it was just directly cribbed from previous anti-Semitic publications and rumors and stuff like that. Hitler believed that Jews were deliberate defilers of women. Jewish men lie in wait for trusting young women whose blood he then defiles by mixing it with his, thereby estranging her from her Volk, or people. Hitler blamed Jews for importing blacks into the Rhineland with the aim of destroying the despised white race. In the cultural arena, Hitler accused Jews of infecting all art, literature, art, and theater, mocking all natural feelings that these inspire, and lowering all others down to his degraded level. Hitler, like many Nazis, were enormous admirers of Richard Wagner, who was a German composer and who became sort of a national symbol of a particular kind of or particular vision of what it meant to be German. A lot of Germans kind of went to Bayreuth, which was where Wagner was headquartered, to watch tellings of his plays and his musicals, his opera. Hitler advances this idea of Völkisch, which is again often described as nearly untranslatable into English. It refers to a populist pan-German ethnic movement that called for the unification of all German-speaking peoples in one nation. Hitler would write, "Only when an abstract longing for freedom is accompanied by organized struggle and actual weapons will that desire be actualized in the most wonderful way." And then he condemns people who believe in racial equality. He basically says that the presumption of racial equality is the gravest mistake ever made. Let's move on and move away from Mein Kampf and talk a little bit about the mostly peaceful path that the Nazis took to power, and in no small part, the way the Nazis came into power was a much more circuitous route than the Italian fascists, who simply marched in, demanded power, and were given it. Part of the problem was that Weimar Germany, and it's important to keep in mind, Germany had only been a unified nation, since 1871 or 1870. Yeah, it's around that time, and they had been largely. I mean, they had some minor democratic elements, but for the most part, they were an empire. The Kaiser Wilhelm was a ruler. He was not just sort of a figurehead. He wielded actual power. The German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, basically governed and managed those democratic elements and manipulated those democratic elements very effectively. And so Hitler began rebuilding the Nazi Party almost the minute he got out of jail. He persuaded Bavarian, the actual beer hall putsch took place in Bavaria, which is one of the largest of the German states, Landstaats. And he persuaded Bavarian officials to lift the ban on Nazi Party organizing, and he began, inveighing against the Treaty of Versailles, and in particular the onerous requirement of reparations payments that Germany was compelled to make to England and France. And you also had something like the Great Depression really hitting Germany hard. There was hyperinflation. Of course, you see pictures of people carrying wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks to the market to buy, goods. In the 1930 elections, the Nazis ran on a platform of repudiating the Treaty of Versailles, strengthening the economy, and providing good-paying jobs for working-class Germans. The pretext for dictatorship really begins. The Nazis won a plurality in parliamentary elections in 1932. Hitler was named chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg, who, if you don't know who Hindenburg was, he was a classic Junker, that was sort of the German noble class. He was a military figure. He had risen to chief of staff position, had retired almost a decade prior to World War I. When World War I broke out, he was given command of the Eastern Front with Russia, and really destroyed the Red Army. I mean, the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front performed incredibly well. Hindenburg was a national hero, resulting from knocking Russia out of the war. And so Hindenburg initially didn't really trust Hitler. didn't want to name him chancellor, but people around him believed that the choice was either Hitler or the communist takeover of the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. And so Hindenburg went ahead kind of against his better judgment and named Hitler to be chancellor. Almost immediately after that, a couple of things happened that are very important. Hindenburg dies, and then you also, and he died of natural causes. He was a very old man. And then you had the Reichstag fire, which the fire, was the parliamentary building was set fire. And Hitler and other prominent Nazis accused the German communists of setting the fire. The chief of the Berlin fire department, Walter Gemp, who personally oversaw the department's fighting of the Reichstag fire, accused Nazis of starting the fire and preventing the department from fully deploying its resources. Gemp was subsequently arrested and imprisoned and was strangled in prison 6 years later. Hitler called snap elections immediately after that, and the Nazis won an increase of the vote from 33% of the Reichstag to 44%. And so the Nazis used the Reichstag fire to Nazify the state-level governments, okay, to basically populate all the German state. Remember, Germany was, even under Weimar, was formed as a republic, and so there were state governments as well as the national government. And then in 1934, you get the Night of the Long Knives. This was basically on June 30th, 1934. It was a purge of the Sturmlubteilung, otherwise known as the brown shirts. Let me say it. Sturmlubteilung. There we go. Okay, these were the Nazi stormtroopers, okay? They were led at the time by a guy named Ernst Röhm, who clearly had ambitions, and there was an ongoing kind of tension between the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, and the SS. Okay, so while the SS or the Schutzstaffel were broadly recruited from the German middle class, the Sturmlubteilung were largely comprised of former unemployed and lower working class Germans. The brown shirts were also decidedly more radical and revolutionary than the SS. Hitler came to view the organization as a threat to his personal leadership. He personally led SS units in the extrajudicial killings of much of the SA's senior leadership. He also used the event to kill several senior members of the more leftist Nazi factions, including Gregor Strasser, who was a founding member of the German Workers' Party, who had increasingly come to differ with Hitler on questions related to ideology. In other words, he basically purged the leftists out of the Nazi Party. There were some left-leaning folks who were more worker-oriented. Remember what I talked about in our discussion of socialism and Lassallism. These were folks that had kind of splintered away from the Lassallism. They were even more nationalists than Ferdinand Lassalle. And so, following that purge, and of course, remember, this is after Hindenburg has died, so there is no kind of national figure that can control the German, the Nazi Party, and especially, keep control of the German military from being Nazified, if you will. So, following the purge, Hitler declared himself to be the supreme leader of the German people, and most people look at the Night of the Long Knives as a demonstration that the Nazis were basically no longer held under criminal law. They could not be tried. They could not be accused under criminal law. So they were effectively invulnerable to legal challenges. And so again, Hitler begins talking about this idea of a Third Reich. And of course, remember the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne, which lasted from 962 to 1806. The German Empire from 1871 to 1918. And so Hitler's announced ambition was to create a 1,000-year Reich in which Germany would be the predominant cultural, political, and military leader of Europe. And when people talk about liberal Nazism, I mentioned this in my first presentation, when you get to Nazism, it's hard to say that there's anything liberal about it, okay? Everything about German Nazism is a reflection of sort of counter-Enlightenment thinking, of this kind of mystified vision of German culture as somehow being wrapped up within some kind of racial idea, okay? And so Hitler, at the time that he comes to power, basically has 4 broad tasks. He persuades the Hindenburg to sign off on the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act. And again, I mentioned Hindenburg was viewed, Hindenburg viewed Hitler as a jumped-up corporal. Remember, Hindenburg was a general officer, and Hitler never rose beyond the rank of corporal. I may have gotten the timing on this wrong. So Hindenburg, ailing, still alive in 1933, basically signs off on giving Hitler emergency powers. And so he has effectively concentrated all power in his person with the Enabling Act. He subsequently insists that all military personnel swear an oath of personal allegiance. And again, Hitler's demand came in the immediate aftermath of Hindenburg's death in 1924 or 1934 and became known as Der Führer's Oath. And it consolidated, again, Hitler's Nazification of the military. And again, the point of any kind of authoritarian system is that you have to populate it with people who are personally loyal to you, okay? And so, in 1934, Hindenburg was really the last guy with the personal prestige that Hitler couldn't really touch. And Hindenburg's death really removes any kind of restraints on Hitler. So the first task was he basically just said, everything, all power comes to me. The second of his tasks was the rearmament of Germany and the repudiation of the reparations payments. And Hitler subsequently, again, the main thing that he wanted to do was get Germany moving again. And so a lot of the stuff he did was sort of like, military rearmament. That's kind of, industrial welfare. Build me guns, planes, and tanks, okay? And the state will pay for it. He also undertook a massive program of public works, mainly in the form of building highways. And he began the process of rebuilding the German military. And remember, the SA and the SS exist. They were basically militia groups. They were not considered to be formal members of the military, because the German military, under the Treaty of Versailles, was not allowed to be beyond, I want to say it was like 10,000. It was a very small requirement. And so Hitler basically said, again, no, we're going to be an independent state. We're going to have as large a military as we want, and we want a large military. And so in kind of encapsulating all the remilitarization of Germany, Hitler engaged in his first really consequential calculated risk, and that was the military occupation of the Rhineland. Now, if you don't know where the Rhineland is, it's a very broad swath of Germany that is basically butting right up into France and Belgium. And so he basically said, we're marching in, we're gonna put military units in there. And it was a calculated risk, because Germany's military in 1936 was utterly unprepared for war. If the French had decided to, if they had said, you know what, we're going to nip this in the bud, they would have defeated the Germans. I mean, just in practical terms, it would have been like a 4-to-1 advantage, France to Germany at that point in time. Many French units were literally pedaling into the Rhineland on bicycles. They did not have the kind of industrial military capacity built up yet. Nowhere near what they would have in 1940. So when you look at again, Germany's kind of rebuilding and kind of getting out of the Great Depression, one of the big things was the building of the German highway system, okay? The origins of highways have emerged in northern Italy in the 1920s. The Führer's roads, as they were called, is often cast as a major contribution to the reduction of unemployment and the improvement of workers' day-to-day, German workers' day-to-day lives. At the end of World War II, when Eisenhower came into Germany, he looked at the Autobahn system and said, yeah, that's something that the United States need. And that was a major thing that one of Eisenhower's signal achievements was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which created a huge sum of money that provided matching funds to state governments for building the highway system. So I-20 all the way up to I-90, all the roads going north and south, those were built by Eisenhower largely over a kind of 15-year period, and they are an enormous source of American wealth. Anywhere you go shopping, the stuff you're buying in most stores got there by truck, and they got there because of the highway system. The third task, according to Hitler, was the idea of Lebensraum, the idea of the need for breathing space needed to become a great empire. He spoke about this in Mein Kampf. He stated in Mein Kampf the need for arable land and abundant oil reserves. And he basically made the argument, that anyone who is not an Aryan is worth nothing except as slaves. And when you look at the map of the German occupied territories, it was especially Poland, and Eastern Europe, kind of Hungary and Romania, and especially portions of the Russian Empire, notably Ukraine. Those were the areas where he believed the German people were destined to expand into and to have breathing space. And in fact, it's pretty clear that Hitler's decision to join with the Russians in the invasion and partition of Poland was step one of his plan for territorial conquest. And then finally, the last of his tasks was the idea of the elimination of all enemies, foreign and domestic. Hitler engaged in full-scale suppression of German Communist Party members. In 1941, following his defeat of France in 1940, and the kind of the stalemate of the Battle of Britain, Germany made a determination, and most military scholars would say it was a mistake for him to leave Great Britain unconquered at his back and then to turn and invade the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, he felt, like he had to do it because of his conviction that Marxist-Leninism constituted a Jewish ideology that had to be eradicated. And then, of course, you get the idea of Adolf Hitler addressing what he called the Jewish problem. And for Hitler, the Jewish problem would be resolved by the final solution. Even in the opening days of World War II, even before then, the German Wehrmacht began forming Einsatzgruppen, deployment groups, to engage in mass killings. Over time, the Nazis determined that deploying soldiers to slaughter thousands of innocent men, women, old men, children, babies, was inefficient on several counts. First, they found that there were simply too many people to effectively kill that way, and the effort required to burn or bury them was too labor intensive, even using slave labor. They also concluded that the steady use of these units eventually would undermine their combat readiness. And units, there were reports of people, German soldiers not being willing to machine gun and gas non-combatants. And so that gave rise to the Nazi concentration camps. Now, by the 1940s, concentration camps were not a new idea. They had been deployed in the 19th century during Spain's 10 Years' War against Cuban guerrillas. They employed concentration camps as a way of controlling the population they believed was fueling the insurrection. The British also used concentration camps in the Second Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902. The Tsarist Russian regime also extensively employed forced labor and internal exile as part of its judicial system, which later would become the basis for the Gulag system used by Stalin, and in fact is still, to some extent, employed in Russia today. The Ottoman Empire also used concentration camps against its Armenian population during World War I, establishing concentration camps in Deir el-Zor desert in northern Syria, near the border of modern-day Turkey in the period 1915 to 1916. So it really was not a new idea. And of course, the United States used, internment camps on Japanese, Americans on the West Coast during the opening days of World War II. There were two 20th century innovations that made concentration camps practicable. The first was the invention of barbed wire, which originated in France but was really first, kind of mass produced in the United States. It was what kind of closed the West, where you no longer had open range. You had people buying land and basically stringing wire. The other invention was the machine gun, which basically meant that small numbers of people could keep a large number of people under control. And again, that made concentration camps labor efficient to manage large numbers of detainees with relatively small numbers of guards. And the Germans were very efficient, very bureaucratic about the final solution. They created what you might just call a triage of extermination. Those deemed unproductive, including the old, sick, children, and most women, were often killed outright. The rest, mostly younger men and healthy men and some women, were systematically worked to death. And that's really how, they basically saying, well, we got to kill these people, and then we got to wage war against the Russians and now the United States. Slave labor is the way to go. And in a lot of instances, German industries benefited from slave labor, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So the price of fanaticism was, first and foremost, the Germans should have recognized as a tactical matter that they needed to basically occupy Britain before they were going to do any kind of eastward moves. However, they reached the basic problem they had was that the Luftwaffe was very good at ground support for blitzkrieg operations, but was not good at strategic bombing. And despite all the bombs they dropped over Britain, they could not defeat the British Air Force. And without air superiority, they were never going to be in a position to actually invade. And so they actually attempted initially to bomb and to attack and to suppress the British Air Force by attacking airfields and things like that. When that didn't work, they began basically unrestricted bombing over British cities, which caused a lot of damage and killed a good number of people, but it didn't break the will of the British people to resist. And so as a result, they found themselves in a stalemate. They decided they didn't have the time to break the stalemate, to muster sufficient forces, to develop the kinds of technologies that would enable them to defeat the British Air Force, and consequently they turned to attack the Soviet Union. And again, the problem with the Soviet Union is, for Hitler was the same problem that Napoleon discovered a little more than a century earlier, and that is the tyranny of distance. The Russians have enormous amounts of territory. They could retreat and harass Nazi supply lines. The Russians began to get large amounts of airplanes and tanks from the Americans through the Lend-Lease Act, on the rationale, again, the friend or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And eventually the German advances got stalled. They simply lacked the numbers to kill enough Russians, and eventually the Russians really turned the tide. The famous Battle of Kursk, 1941, I want to say, the largest tank battle in the world. Ultimately, the Germans were defeated, and the Russians, from that point, had the advantage and held the initiative for much of the remainder of the war. In an important sense, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the war, and Hitler felt compelled to declare war on the United States in solidarity with his ally Japan. That created a real, again, problem because now you had the industrial might of the largest economy in the world entering the fray in full force. And within a couple of years, the United States had driven the Nazis and the Italians out of northern Africa. They had established a foothold in Italy. And then ultimately they landed in Normandy. And that really, once the United States established a beachhead at Normandy, the war was effectively, the outcome of the war was largely to be determined. The Germans simply did not have the manpower to fight both the Russians and the United States. And so, to some extent, the commitment to the final solution contributed to the Nazis' overcommitment and collapse. As they were being driven out of Russia in many instances, SS units that were running extermination camps in Ukraine had priority over Wehrmacht units. And what the Red Army found, it was ironic, and again, this goes back to it has echoes of what we're dealing with today. The Ukrainians basically greeted the Nazis as liberators. And the Nazis repaid that greeting by, again, systematically killing Ukrainians. They behaved with enormous cruelty to the Ukrainians and began rounding up Jews and just murdering people. And again, to no small extent, that commitment, the material commitment to just killing people that they deemed as subhuman, was a contributing factor in the end to their defeat. So Nazism in theory and practice, to some extent, Nazism reflects the same kind of hypernationalism and hatred of liberalism and socialism as Italian fascism, but it adds a fanatical element of racism to its totalitarian ethos. And it's important to keep in mind, I don't know that Italy was, in Italy, Mussolini coined the phrase totalitarian, but Italy was never itself sufficiently unified to be characterized as a totalitarian state. Germany, on the other hand, was. And I think you could make the argument that the two totalitarian states that were at war, during World War II, were Germany and Stalinist Russia. So there is a familial resemblance between between Italian fascism and German Nazism. There are similar ideological commitments. They hate liberalism, they hate socialism, they are virulently anti-democratic. They have a similar view of mass society. The same idea that people don't have a worth, and that to the extent that the mass has a worth, it's only to the extent that the mass is pulling in a nationalist direction. They have the same kind of artistic aesthetics, the same arguments about manliness and virility, the same obsessions, with warfare. And ultimately the same commitment to nationalism and to wars of conquest. But Italy, of course, simply lacked the military and industrial capacity to actually successfully conquer other countries. So one thing that that tends to throw people off is that part of the Nazi acronym that is national, but also socialist, right? So the Nazis, again, it's important to keep in mind that the German fascists were dealing with a Germany where the socialists had been successful in their appeals to German workers for decades. And so as a result, the forerunner of the Nazi Party, the German Workers' Party, often appropriated terms like socialism to appeal to German workers and to try and peel off especially Social Democratic Party members, less so German communists. Hitler would once say, I love the socialists. They're disciplined and they're good street fighters. I'll take them on anytime, so long as they sign on to the program. So neither Hitler nor Mussolini had much interest in economics. They both rejected class conflict in favor of nationalism. It's important, that whole fascist ideology, everything inside the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. They rejected the whole idea of class conflict. Hitler expressly rejected Marxism and really adopted sort of an idiosyncratic meaning of socialism. He would effectively conflate socialism with nationalism, declaring every true national idea is in the last resort social, that he who is prepared so completely to adopt the cause of his people that he really knows no higher ideal than the prosperity of this his own people, he who has taken up to heart the meaning of our great song, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, in Germany, Germany overall, that nothing in this world stands for him higher than Germany, people and land, land and people. He is a socialist. He is not merely a socialist, but he is also national in the highest sense of the word. So when the Nazis are using phrases like socialism, they're not using it in the way that most socialists would accept as being part of their learning tree, right? And you also have something which is effectively, yes, it is kind of a collectivized government control of the economy, but it's more like state-assisted capitalism than it is a really thoroughgoing socialist enterprise. Unlike kind of Italian corporatism, Germans also employed a kind of corporatism, but they generally viewed economic matters, the Nazis especially, as beneath their notice. As a practical matter, the Nazis were generally inclined to privatizing companies that had previously been state-owned. As noted earlier, the Nazis also engaged in extensive infrastructure investment, building canals, railways, and highways. So ownership of Germany's largest corporations remained privately owned. And that that reflects that Hitler co-opted rather than conquered the German industrial class. So the Nazi regime, what was the buy-in for the corporates? For industry. It was that the Nazi regime would subsidize these companies with access to free labor. Free labor is hard to beat, right? So reliance on slavery is, it does not jive with any understanding of socialism, right? Nazism was obsessed with the idea of purity, the idea of Volksstaat, the Volkish state must set race at the center of all life. It must take care to keep it pure. Abortion was outlawed for Aryan women, while it was extensively permitted and sometimes imposed on Jewish and non-Aryan women. Nazis heavily subsidized Aryan families to encourage them to have more children. There were lots and lots of these state foundries where, these Nazi babies were born that were going to be raised by the German state and effectively turned into soldiers of the state. Certain SS officers got permission to visit state-operated breeding centers where they would be busy impregnating Aryan women. This is the kind of natalism. I mean, it's spooky what they were doing. I mean, this is stuff that's like eugenics in the ugliest way, where they're basically putting this racial ideology to state use in a way that I think horrified most Americans of the day, and I'd like to think horrifies people to this day. Nazi art. The Nazis attacked most modern art as degenerative, as originating from bad Jewish ideas. The Nazi aesthetic was, if you look at their buildings, it was all very plain and unadorned, a kind of brutalism. The Nazi belief that all artists, painters, sculptors, and musicians should serve the state. This reflects something that kind of Plato would say in the Republic. Everything should be, kind of geared towards advancing the beauty and the glory of the state. Nazi science. It's important to keep in mind that many of the enormous scientific advances that occurred in England and the United States, and also to some extent in Russia, were by Jewish scientists who escaped from Nazi Germany. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity was dismissed as Jewish science. And part of the reason why the United States developed an atomic bomb before the Nazis is that their physicists were really almost ideologically barred from following up on Einstein's ideas. And so the Nazis were focused on practical applications that were aligned with Nazi ideology, which was to say, they went in a lot of blind holes looking for, practical, what they thought, shooting a better bullet or a bigger gun. They had some breakthroughs on jet engines for aircraft. The Nazis also extensively experimented on human beings, on Jews and other people that they designated as less human. There's a picture in this slide of a guy he's testing out a new flight suit in icy cold waters. We know that the human body shuts down at a certain body, when it hits a certain body temperature, because they conducted those experiments, because they were interested in what was going to happen when their aircraft got shot down over the Atlantic. They wanted to know how long they had to try and rescue their pilots. And so the fact we know these things and we apply this scientific knowledge doesn't mean, again, the problem is you can't replicate that stuff. Not in any kind of meaningful, in any kind of ethically meaningful way. You cannot kill people to advance science. We simply reject that. And I think we're right to reject it. So fascism itself is not inevitably racist. So you would say, not all fascists are racist, but all Nazis are, okay? So fascism was not innately racist, but Nazism is ineluctably racist. It is an inescapably racist variant of fascism. So when you think about Nazism, it is fascism plus racism equals Nazism. And that again reflects the extent to which, Nazism is built around the worldview of Adolf Hitler. So human nature and freedom. For the Nazis, all questions related to human nature revolved around the issue of race. And so, again, like many of the counter-Enlightenment thinkers we addressed in both conservatism and in our early discussions of fascism, Nazis expressly reject the universal, any notions of universalism in human nature. For Nazis, the differences between the races are deep, innate, and permanent. I think Hitler would almost say they are genetic. Hitler would say that we are, an Aryan person is genetically distinct from, or he wanted that to be, because even as he was saying these things, even as he said that the titmouse only breeds with the titmouse, he knew about interbreeding. He knew that human beings of different races had, sex and had offspring. He understood that, but he wanted it to be, he willed it to be almost genetic in nature. And so for Nazis, racial stereotyping is common. Orientals are crafty, blacks are stupid, Jews are greedy, Aryans are the master race. And this is sort of the way, Nazism provides its own rationale. A lot of this is recycled, racism. Much as, for example, Stalin was really a dogmatic, not really a nuanced theorist at all, studied very little philosophy. Hitler was basically untutored in political theory, and was additionally simply not an original thinker. So the racism that you find in Mein Kampf is oftentimes recycled from earlier racial theorists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of them being Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose Foundations of the 19th Century was widely read by the Nazis. And so he was actually a British aristocrat. He was a philosopher and historian. He came to hate England and espoused a kind of virulent anti-Semitism and spoke of scientific racism. In his later years, Chamberlain, who became an ardent Wagnerian and who married the daughter of Richard Wagner, was influential among high-ranking Nazis like Joseph Goebbels, who publicly claimed they converted to Volkisch ideology through reading Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century. And so, in effect, people like Chamberlain, these are germophiles who are criticizing Jews for debasing human culture. And Chamberlain is one of the first people to declare that the only way to rescue Western society was the forced removal of Jews from Europe. Another kind of wellspring of German Nazi racism is Ludwig Voltmann, who wrote the book Historical Materialism in 1903. He argued that race was the missing component in Marxist theory. He argued that the concentration of all major achievements in art, music, literature, philosophy, and industry is basically due to the Aryan race. And he had kind of a climatic reason for this. He basically said that Europe's temperate climate was the reason for European civilizational advances. He would be riffing kind of on some stuff that Montesquieu would write in one of his less sane moments, basically saying that because Europe has a temperate climate, they have more time for thinking outside the box, whereas if you're living in an extraordinarily hot climate, you're prone to laziness, and if you're living in an extraordinarily cold climate, your main object is survival on a day-to-day basis. Social Darwinism was a major theory behind the Nazis. And again, social Darwinism, it was a very popular theory. It stemmed from Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, and which is really one of the foundational points of biology. The idea that natural evolution occurs. Social Darwinism, as applied to humanity, was a broadly popular pseudoscientific theory, which applied a variant of natural selection to humanity. And again, the basic theory of natural selection is that people and animals generally evolve according to the demands of their environment. And so for the social Darwinists, they kind of use Darwinism as a logical argument to say that life is a very severe test. It's about survival of the fittest. And they use that as a rationale to explain colonialism. Okay? Steven Pinker would describe the idea that the survival of the fittest is basically just part of nature. He would describe that as a rhetorical technique in which a person asserts, often without evidence, that a thing is good because it's natural or bad because it's not natural. And in that sense, you see this a lot. You see it a lot. When you hear Gobineau's rationales, a lot of it is just basically unsupported assertions. Racists were also attracted to the ideas of Thomas Malthus, who was a kind of a second phase classical economist. He was famous for concluding that while food supplies generally increase at an arithmetical rate, which is to say, 2 plus 2 equals 4, stuff like that, human populations tend to expand at a geometric rate, which is to say, humans can grow in terms of the size of their community enormously fast. And at some point, Malthus predicted that the resulting population crisis would greatly increase the likelihood of war over increasingly scarce arable land, and along with such competition, increased instances of for famine and starvation. So again, for the Nazis, in the early 20th century, that a lot of people, not just the Nazis, but a lot of people believed that the world was rapidly approaching a population glut that would outstrip the available food supplies. And so sociologists like Voltman were basically making the argument that sooner or later the world's going to become a war of all against all. And for Voltman, it would be a class war. Okay. You also had the American Madison Grant, who kind of lived, contemporaneously. He died in the midst of World War II or World War I. His book, The Passing of the Great Race, 1960s or 1916, traced the history of Europe through an examination of race, and he advanced the idea of Nordicism, of the Nordic peoples, as being a keystone race. And so, Grant was an enthusiastic eugenicist. He advocated restricting immigration, and that influenced the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924 that sharply reduced the number of people allowed into the country from places like Ireland and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Henry Ford was an enormously influential guy in his time and exerted enormous influence over the Nazis. So he was, obviously a famous automobile manufacturer, but he was also, perhaps less famously or perhaps more infamously, he was well known as a virulent anti-Semite. He contributed articles for the Dearborn Independence, which was, Dearborn, Michigan, I believe. And, where he, with titles like The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. Ford did everything he could do to advance the cause of Nazi Germany, and was ultimately awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of the German Eagle for meritorious service to the fatherland. That is the highest honor that a German head of state can bestow upon a non-German. So Hitler would write, "Only Ford still maintains full independence from the controlling masters of the producers of media," you should say. So all these racial ideas kind of come together in a rationale for just killing people. And again, it was a widely spread conviction that miscegenation, that race mixing, contributed to mongrelization of races. And Hitler's conviction, he said it over and over again, that Jews were poisoning the blood of the white race. He oftentimes, watched racism converted. He oftentimes worked to convert racism into law. Hitler sent German lawyers to the United States to study the way that southern states had used the law to discriminate against blacks. Nazi use of the law to discriminate included immigration restrictions, laws banning miscegenation, and the forced sterilization of people categorized as inhuman or subhuman. Another book that was very important to Nazis was The Myth of the 20th Century. The title of the book, by that name, was published in 1930 by the Nazi theorist Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg was, he basically moved within the Nazi wartime, bureaucracy. At one point, he actually was working with the SS on the final solution. He was one of those folks captured by Allied authorities in 1945, I guess. And he was tried during the Nuremberg trials and convicted and sentenced to death. So what exactly was the Holocaust? This was the widespread, again, racist ideas that justified the Nazi invasion of Poland and the USSR as the Volk's rightful Lebensraum. Racism justified book burnings and censorship. Ultimately, racism provided the justification for the mass killings of Jews. Again, you had the systematic enslavement and murder of millions of Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, gays, and the handicapped. So how did the Nazis view freedom? They saw it purely in racial terms, and they basically said that only one group of humans truly deserves freedom, and that is the Aryan race. The myth of the Aryan race for the Germans was as a culture-creating race. The destiny of the German Volk is to dominate, enslave, and even exterminate lesser races. And so again, liberal and socialist notions of freedom are rejected because for them, freedom is always going to be individual. There will be the individual capacity to be creative for the socialist, or to have equal access to goods. For liberals, it's even more obviously the individual as a bearer of rights. Nazis expressly reject that idea. And so again, this is the Nazi view of freedom. The agent is the Aryan race. The obstacle is inferior races, individualism, and class divisions. And the goal is racial supremacy and a 1,000-year Reich, according to Adolf Hitler. And so for Germans, there is no real conception of freedom as it relates to individuals. For them, freedom is achieved through the idea of Volkisch, right? The person is an organism. Only one individual has significance, and that is der Führer. And there was only one of those. Individuals are mere cells in the larger organism. Outside the Volksgemeinschaft, the racially pure people's community, individuals are mere specks of dust. Resistance to Nazism was kind of sporadic. Within Germany, Hitler was widely popular. I think it's pretty clear to say that large numbers of Germans fervently supported Hitler. I doubt that at any point in time it was more than 60% that really bought into the Nazi agenda. There was always a large number of quiescent Germans in electoral politics. But there was resistance to Nazi rule in Germany and in the occupied territories. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian, vocally opposed to Nazi policies. He was jailed twice. The second time he was basically summarily executed. You also had, again, the German staff, the German general staff. There was an assassination attempt on Hitler by a cabal of German generals led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was an aristocratic German general who believed that Hitler was destroying Germany and that the war was lost, and that if they didn't do something, this was the July 20th plot where Hitler, the bomb blew up in the room where Hitler was, but Hitler was, aside from some deafness, unharmed. You also had a group of university students called the White Rose Group. These were, again, university students who painted anti-Nazi graffiti and distributed pamphlets. They were attempting to consciousness raise, to basically alert everyday Germans to the atrocities that the Nazis were perpetrating. They did engage in some nonviolent sabotage. On occasion, when people were shot, when Allied airmen were shot down over Germany proper, those folks would try to hide them and get them to safety. Most of these people were captured and they were summarily executed. Some Germans did try to hide Jews to prevent their shipment to death camps. Same thing happened in some other countries. In other countries, in Poland, for example, the Poles, they were perfectly willing to see the Jews go into the death camps. So on this slide, you've got Pastor Martin Niemöller's famous poem, "First They Came for the Socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." And that's really how, an authoritarian fascist state becomes a totalitarian state. And again, one of the things that differentiated Italian fascism from German Nazism was the sheer size and effectiveness of the Gestapo, of the German secret police, which again, wielded enormous resources to identifying people that were hostile to the Nazi program, and they were entirely ruthless in killing people. And people knew that, and much like in Stalinist Russia, the Soviet Union, folks were absolutely terrified. There was very little open dissent of what the Nazis were doing. And there were some concentration camps that were within Germany proper, where, again, people within the town, they would say, they would be questioned. Why didn't you do anything? And so we didn't know, they would claim. And people would say, you can smell the smell of people being gassed and burned to death. How can you say you didn't know? And that was a question for which a lot of German citizens didn't have really good answers. They simply, in many instances, they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, draw attention of the German state. There was considerable resistance in some of the occupied territories. Probably the best known is the French resistance. which was the largest and the most organized. The French, ironically, were some of the most passionately pro-Nazi groups. The Vichy government was overtly fascistic. But then you also had the French communists and socialists who were fervently anti-fascist. And so the French resistance was probably the largest in all the occupied territories. And again, it was comprised of a polyglot group of communists, socialists, and other anti-fascist elements. They engaged in extensive sabotage. They sheltered Allied airmen who were shot down over occupied France and got them back across into England. And the Nazis, again, were entirely ruthless in terms of how they dealt with that kind of resistance. And the idea, it is considered now to be a violation of the Geneva Conventions and a war crime to engage in what was known as collective punishment, where you would, the Nazis would, if they were in, for example, Serbia, and a German soldier got killed or something like that, they would go to the village and they would say, look, we want to know who did this. And if no one would come forward, they would just grab 10 people and shoot them in the head. And that would be the start. And they would just, we'll kill 100 people. We'll kill as many people as we need to until we get this resolved. That is considered to be a war crime today. And again, that kind of reflects some of the challenges that we look at when we're looking at events today. Because again, the reason why why international law emerged was from what the Nazis and frankly the Stalinist Red Army was doing routinely. So there were other places in Denmark. I think it was Denmark and in the Netherlands. There was a pretty kind of well-organized resistance that were doing a lot of the same things that the French were doing. I can't remember if it was in Denmark where people would go to work naked as a way of just pointing to the absurdity of Nazi occupation of their country. And so again, the problem was that resistance doesn't work when people are prepared to just be utterly ruthless. And so that has been, that's one of the lessons of history, that failure of an authoritarian regime to be ruthless is oftentimes viewed as a symptom of weakness. So that's all I've got for today. When we come back, we are going to continue our discussion of fascism. We'll bring our consideration and analysis of fascism into the present day, and we will explore sort of the challenges of understanding who is a fascist, when do we consider someone who might otherwise be considered to be an authoritarian, when do we figure that they have crossed that line and are acting in a fascistic way. I'll see you next time.